Hi, my name is Shelby, and this is Merrily Morbid. There is a rare condition that affects people other than the person who has it. Today, in the medical field, it is known as factitious disorder imposed on another, or FDIA. Although most people are familiar with the former name of the condition, Munchausen Syndrome by Proxy. It is a form of Munchausen Syndrome, where a person pretends to be sick or intentionally makes themselves sick in order to gain attention from family, friends, medical professionals, or online strangers. The name of the condition comes from Baron Freyer von Munchausen, who was a German military officer in the 1700s and was famous for telling outlandish and exaggerated stories of his life. Munchausen by proxy is when a person pretends or makes another person sick to gain attention or praise for their devotion to their sick or disabled kid or relative. Their victims are usually children, but can also be a person in their care. It's important to mention that although they may receive money and gifts, their main reason for their lies is to gain attention. People with Munchausen's may also get enjoyment out of getting important and powerful people, such as doctors and psychiatrists, to believe their lies. Munchausen's is often confused with malingering, which is when a person fakes illness in order to benefit financially or to get out of legal trouble. So who has Munchausen's by proxy? It usually affects women between 20 and 40 years old, and many have Munchausen syndrome as well. These people often have other mental illnesses such as borderline personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder. They will also have problems with self-esteem and their identity. And there is some data that shows that children who are abused or neglected have a higher risk of developing Munchausen's than other people. There is also evidence that shows that young people who lost a parent at a young age have higher rates of Munchausen's. And unsurprisingly, those who were the victims of people with Munchausen's by proxy are more likely to develop Munchausen's themselves in adulthood. These people often are particularly interested and know more about medical details than the average person, and sometimes they themselves work in the healthcare field. Regardless of whether they have a job in the medical field, they usually feel very comfortable in hospital environments. It is often difficult to diagnose Munchausen's or Munchausen's by proxy, as they often switch doctors and don't give permission for prior records to be shared with new doctors. One statistic I found stated that it was believed that 1% of the U.S. population has Munchausen's to one degree or another. It's important to know that because of the nature of that condition, it's impossible to know how many people actually have Munchausen's or Munchausen's by proxy, especially since they often deny their behavior and will deny it even after being caught in the act. These people have compulsions to lie. The treatment for it usually entails psychotherapy, where the person works on changing their thinking processes and their behaviors. Regardless of it being classified as a mental illness, it is extremely to know that Munchausen's by proxy at its core is the medical abuse of another person. If a person is suspected to have Munchausen's by proxy, Child Protective Services should be contacted, and the hospital should get their legal department involved. It is extremely important not only because it's abuse, but because there is around a 10% death rate among victims of Munchausen's by proxy. The victims are usually children under the age of 6, but as mentioned before, can also be a disabled adult or an elderly person. These people will suffer from conditions such as failure to thrive, allergies, asthma, vomiting and diarrhea, seizures, infections, chronic diseases such as diabetes, or even cancer. What makes these people stand out from others with the same conditions are that they will have multiple conditions. For example, a person will have diabetes and cancer, or they will have cystic fibrosis and an autoimmune disease. They will have strange symptoms that do not match their conditions or any known condition. They may have symptoms that just so happen when they aren't around doctors or nurses. For example, someone claiming that their kid has seizures, but they never seem to have one while in the presence of a doctor. They'll have test results that don't make any sense or are impossible and don't match the appearance of the victim. For example, an extremely high blood sugar test that would make the person unconscious, but the person is up and talking, looking and feeling fine. They may have an illness that doesn't respond to treatment. They can suddenly have new symptoms after tests come back negative. The victim may get better while in the hospital, be released, and then return shortly afterwards, sick as ever. Their caretaker may refuse to leave the bedside of their victim and seems to be eager to have additional tests and procedures done. They may report that their victim is getting worse, even as the doctors can see themselves that that isn't true. These people will also become visibly angry when a doctor tells them that there's nothing wrong with their victim. They will also refuse to allow doctors and nurses to speak with other people, such as family or previous healthcare providers. All the while, they will act so very concerned about their victim. The person with Munchausen's by proxy will try to convince doctors of their victim's illness through manipulation of medical tests or falsifying medical records. If they don't just feign illness in their victim, they will actually make them sick. They may create symptoms in their victim by poisoning, suffocating, or starving them, or even sometimes causing them to have infections. As it is discovered that a person has Munchausen Syndrome by proxy, their victim's symptoms may get worse as they try to prove that their victim is really sick. It is also possible that they may take their victim and flee, moving to another location to avoid prosecution and to keep their ruse going. So now let's take a look at some cases. One involves a woman who not only had Munchausen's herself, but also had Munchausen Syndrome by proxy. One involves a woman who didn't enjoy the attention that she got from having sick children, but did enjoy the attention that she got after each of her children died. And then perhaps the most famous case, where a woman's victim, her daughter, took her own life back into her hands while taking her mother's life. Hope Ybarra was described as her sister as being the perfect student growing up. She took on a lot of responsibility when it came to her 3 younger siblings, but she never seemed to let the pressure get to her. She was fun, magnetic, and had a lot of friends. She would act as a chauffeur for her siblings, bringing them to their sports and clubs even while she had her own clubs, and she was in jazz band and marching band. She played several instruments and was considered talented. Looking back, Hope's father believes that the first time she exhibited signs of Munchausen's was back in high school. At age 16, she fell out of bed onto the tile floor and hurt her back. She was in a lot of pain and was in a wheelchair for months, and she got a lot of attention during that time. After several months, doctors told her parents that they could not find any reason why she would still need the wheelchair, but Hope would continue to use it. Her sister believes that what happened next was also attention-seeking behavior. Hope had expressed wanting to be able to walk across the stage at her graduation, and like a miracle, she regained her ability to walk just in time. Then, months later, she went off to college like nothing had ever happened. But randomly one day, her mother got a phone call saying that Hope had had a seizure and was found on the floor of her dorm room. Her mother rushed to the college to pick her up, brought her home, and nursed her back to health. Soon enough, she was back in school again. While in college, she met Fabian Ybarra, and they would soon have their first child. She would say that there were complications and that her tailbone had been broken during the birth. Again, her mother would come to her aid and nurse her back to health. At this point, Hope decided that her major in the veterinary program was too difficult to juggle with being a new mother, so she switched her major to chemistry. It wasn't long before Hope and Fabian got married, and they had their second child. Everything seemed to be going great. She had graduated and gotten a job as a chemist. Hope had even gone to night school and taken online classes, gotten her PhD in chemistry. Her husband had become a teacher. They had their own home. Life was good. Then baby number 3 was on the way. When Hope was 7 months pregnant, she fell down the stairs and went into preterm labor. Hope became a NICU mom when her daughter was born at only 28 weeks. As you can imagine, she probably got a lot of attention being the mother of such a sick preemie baby. And soon, her daughter was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis, and she would always be sick. Unfortunately, cystic fibrosis is terminal, and her case was particularly aggressive, and they didn't believe that she would live long enough to reach her teens. Then, Hope would reveal that she was pregnant again and expecting twin girls this time. Unfortunately, she had a miscarriage, and their ashes would have a permanent place in an urn in the living room. Then, in 2000, she told her husband that she'd found a lump on her arm and was concerned. Soon after, she revealed to her family that she had a type of bone cancer called Ewing sarcoma, and that she would have to undergo radiation and chemo. After 6 months of treatment, she let everyone know that she was in remission. A huge party was held to celebrate her beating cancer, but unfortunately her remission wouldn't last. 2 years later, the cancer was back and had spread to the brain and her lungs. But she fought it and beat it a second time. The party to celebrate her beating cancer a second time was even bigger than the first party, and she even went skydiving to celebrate. Again, it wasn't going to last. In 2008, she told her family that her cancer was back again for the 3rd time. It was in her lungs, bones, and this time she didn't want to fight anymore. Her parents had a hard time accepting that she didn't want to fight, and they began seeing counselors to help them through their grief as they prepared for Hope to die. Hope decided to make arrangements. She picked out a cemetery that she felt would be peaceful for her family to visit her at. She brought her mother with her when she went to the funeral home to pick out her casket and make funeral plans. She also began preparing her children for her coming death. She even told her youngest daughter, the one who had cystic fibrosis, that she would be waiting for her in heaven and that she shouldn't be scared of dying. In 2009, Hope was in the hospital receiving pain management as her family believed the end was near. Then, a phone call changed everything. Hope's mother received a phone call from one of her doctors asking for copies of her medical records and the names of her other doctors. Her mother started looking for the papers and couldn't find anything. In fact, she couldn't find anything medical related. She couldn't find as much as a prescription bottle. Since Hope was a cancer patient, where were the medications, the medical supplies, insurance, and hospital bills? Hope's mother called Fabian to ask for the login information for their insurance company's website. Even then, she found nothing. How was that possible? There were no claims through the insurance company. Not for cancer treatments, diagnostic tests, appointments, or anything. Even going back years, there was nothing. So she decided to see the doctor that had called her in person. At the hospital, Hope's mother and that doctor went into a private room to talk. Due to her own education and background, she told the doctor that she had reason to believe that Hope actually didn't have cancer, never had cancer, and probably had Munchausen Syndrome. The doctor told her that he believed she was right. Hope's mother quickly headed up to Hope's hospital room, where she confronted her, and Hope actually admitted it. She didn't even try to deny it. Hope's mother and husband realized that neither of them had ever gone to any of her appointments. She would always give them an excuse or tell them to save their sick days for when she would really need them. They realized that she was really thriving off of all the attention she'd been getting. Then they began questioning other things. If she was capable of telling her family that she was dying after an 8-year battle with cancer, what else could she be lying about? Fabian would learn that Hope didn't have a PhD in chemistry. She lied to him about taking night classes. Even now, he does not know where she went when she was supposed to be in class. Then, her family realized that the twin girls that Hope had been pregnant with never existed in the first place. The urn in their living room was empty. To make her lie seem even more real, at one point she got a tattoo on her back of wings and 5 stars. The wings represented her battle with cancer, and 3 of the stars represented her 3 living children, and 2 stars represented her twin girls in heaven. But that wasn't the darkest turn that this story would take. The next disturbing thought that her family had was, since her own deadly illness hadn't been real, had she faked her daughter's deadly illness too? Her youngest child, who was 6, had been diagnosed with cystic fibrosis as an infant and had spent most of her life in the hospital. She'd even had lung infections all the time. Even when she was at home, she was still on a lot of medication. Hope's mother was worried that her granddaughter wasn't safe, and she immediately informed her granddaughter's doctor of her mother's faked illness. CPS was quickly involved, and Hope and Fabian were told to bring their daughter to the hospital immediately. When they arrived, they learned that their daughter was going to undergo a sweat test to see if her cystic fibrosis diagnosis was real or not. Even as the test was being performed, Hope was acting anxious and even tried calling her daughter over to her and tried to tamper with the test in full view of a nurse and a child life specialist who were in the room. The test revealed that Hope's daughter did not have cystic fibrosis. Hope had tortured her poor daughter and had needlessly put her through operations, procedures, and had drugged her with medications. Immediately, Child Protective Services prohibited Hope from having any contact with her daughter. The little girl had her ports removed and her feeding tube removed. She was taken off oxygen and all of her medications were stopped. She was finally able to be a normal kid and was even able to start attending school in person for the first time in her life. Hope moved 30 minutes away as investigations into her case began. The detectives were looking for hard evidence that she medically abused her daughter. When the detectives got access to the little girl's medical records, they saw that she was diagnosed with recurrent bacterial lung infections. They had an idea that with Hope's chemistry background, that they should contact her former employer to see if they could shed any light on the investigation. The employer told the investigators that Hope had been fired after they learned that she had lied about her credentials, and that there were suspicions that she'd poisoned a couple of her co-workers. Investigators asked to see surveillance video of Hope's activity in the building, and soon they discovered that one night she had gone into work with a large handbag. Cameras caught Hope placing multiple petri dishes filled with bacteria into her bag before leaving. That's when the investigators realized that Hope had exposed her daughter to bacteria that she'd stolen from work. They found that 4 out of the 9 pathogens that were stolen were found in her daughter's system. Further investigation would also reveal that her daughter had had many episodes of anemia. One episode was so bad that it had required an iron infusion. In some people, iron infusions can cause a deadly allergic reaction, so it's administered very slowly until the doctor is sure that there's no bad reaction. Right before her daughter was going to be given the iron infusion, she told the doctor that she'd had these infusions before and had had no bad reactions, so there was no need for her to be tested for the allergy first. However, this was a lie. Still, the doctor thankfully decided to err on the side of caution. As he began the infusion, Hope's daughter did react and did actually begin having an episode of anaphylaxis. Thankfully, since it was only a small amount to begin with, they were able to get a hold of the situation quickly, and Hope's daughter was okay. If they'd pushed the iron infusion like Hope had wanted, her daughter probably would not have survived. It was soon discovered that her daughter's anemic episodes were also of her creation. She was anemic, but that was because Hope was draining blood out of her port, and had even drained up to half a liter of blood at a time. My calculations put that at 1/3 of her blood at one time. That poor child almost bled to death multiple times at the hands of her own mother. But of course, that wasn't the end of Hope's games. She would end up having an accident, and it was believed that she suffered brain damage and that she would never recover. But another miracle. 2 days later, she was up and walking and talking. As soon as she was released from the physical rehab center, she was arrested for medical child abuse. She pled guilty and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. When interviewed in prison, she said that she had gone to prison for allowing her daughter to undergo procedures that she didn't need. Way to not take responsibility. And even as she was in prison, she would continue to suffer from various ills. She developed diabetes, epilepsy, and deafness. Her husband divorced her, and her parents eventually stopped visiting her in prison when they realized that she wasn't going to stop pretending to develop these illnesses. The last time they visited her was in 2014. Hope was released from prison in 2019 and subsequently moved to Idaho. In 2022, she was on a podcast and told the interviewer that she had a boyfriend and that she would be starting a job at Walmart soon. The next person I'm going to talk about didn't get satisfaction out of faking illness for herself, and she didn't get enough satisfaction from having sick children. She would do the worst thing that a mother can do to her children. Marybeth Tinning would become famous after being arrested for the death of her daughter, Tammy Lynn. But she wasn't Marybeth's first child to die, not her second, or even her third child. Tammy Lynn was her 9th child, and her 9th child to die. And this wasn't back in the 1800s where it was common for children to pass away young. This was in the 1970s into the 1980s. It is unbelievable that she was able to get away with it for so long. Marybeth Rowe was described as average when she was in school. She had wanted to go to college, but she never got there. Marybeth worked many lowly jobs, but would eventually get a job as a nurse's aide in Schenectady, just 10 miles from where she grew up. Eventually, she met Joe Tinning, who she married in 1965. It is interesting that she was basically the opposite of Hope Ybarra. Hope was pretty and popular and had seemed like a very happy person with a good job. Marybeth Tinning worked dead-end jobs, wasn't considered pretty, and was described as never a happy, well-adjusted adult. Yet both thrived when they were the center of attention, and, coincidentally, their third children were their first victims. Everything seemed fine as Marybeth had her first child, a daughter, Barbara Ann, in 1967, and she had her second child, a son, Joseph Jr., in 1970. But in 1971, tragedy would strike her family for the first time. While Marybeth was pregnant with her third child, her father died suddenly from a heart attack. Marybeth was deeply affected by it and continued to be, which is understandable. In December, the day after Christmas, her third child, a daughter she named Jennifer, was born very sick. She was born with bacterial meningitis and died when she was only 8 days old on January 3, 1972. A famous forensic pathologist, Dr. Michael Baden, was famous for being one of the forensic specialists on the board that investigated JFK's assassination. Looking into the case later, he believed that although Jennifer's death was ruled natural, it was anything but. He had reason to believe that Marybeth wanted her daughter born on Christmas as some kind of homage to her father. In order to make sure this happened, it's believed that she used a hanger to induce labor. This inadvertently introduced bacteria into the womb, which led to Jennifer's deadly infection. It was done in vain anyway because she wasn't born till the day after Christmas. Now, it can be reasoned that Jennifer's death did something to Marybeth because it was only the first domino to fall, but they fell quickly. Just 17 days after Jennifer died and 10 days after Joseph Jr.'s second birthday, he was rushed to the hospital by his mother, who'd said he had had a seizure. He was stabilized and sent home. Just a few hours later, Marybeth rushed Joseph Jr. back to the hospital, but this time there was nothing to be done. He was already dead. She told the doctors that when she'd gotten home earlier, she'd put him to bed, and when he had slept longer than usual, she went in and found him, tangled up in the sheets, and his body was blue. He died on January 20th, 1972. His cause of death went on the official records as unknown, and no autopsy was performed. Then, just 6 weeks after Joseph Jr. died, that's 42 days, Marybeth rushed her unconscious firstborn, 4-year-old Barbara, into the ER. She told the doctors that she'd also had a seizure. Barbara was admitted, and the doctors wanted her to stay overnight for observation. Marybeth insisted on taking her home, though. Just like with Joseph, a few hours later, Marybeth was back at the hospital with Barbara, who was unconscious. She died while in the hospital on March 2nd, 1972. Her cause of death was recorded as unknown. There was a suspicion that there was a rare disorder called Rey syndrome that may have killed her. It causes massive amounts of fat to accumulate in the body, usually following an illness. But it was never proven. I couldn't find anything that said an autopsy was performed on Barbara, although I did find a single source that said that she actually did have a recorded cause of death as cardiac arrest. What is shocking to me is that Marybeth lost all 3 of her children in a 60-day period. Her newborn was one thing, but to have also lost her 2-year-old and 4-year-old, it's unbelievable to me that there was no investigation. Some people believe that it was perhaps an inherited condition that the parents had passed on. But regardless, 3 dead children in 60 days begs for an investigation. Unreal. Timothy Tinning, their 4th child, was born in 1973. He was born the day before Thanksgiving, and he was born healthy and went home at 2 days old. Timothy was 20 days old when Marybeth carried his lifeless body into the hospital. She claimed to have found him unresponsive in his crib. He was pronounced dead, and his cause of death was determined to be SIDS. No investigation was done. Nathan Tinning, their 5th child, was born in 1975 on March 30th, Easter Sunday. Again, he was healthy. He was described as the most perfect, beautiful baby boy by a family friend. He was 5 months old when he died. Marybeth said she'd been driving with Nathan in the seat beside her when she looked down and saw that he wasn't breathing. His death was ruled as pulmonary edema. Once again, the police didn't investigate. At this point, her death toll was 5. Michael Tinning, their 6th child, was adopted. He was born August 3rd, 1978. The Tinnings had begun the adoption process when they found out that they were pregnant again, but they decided to move forward with the adoption anyway. Mary Frances Tinning was born a few months later on October 29th. She lived until January when she had a seizure, and Marybeth rushed her to the hospital. She was revived and allowed to go home. Just days later, Marybeth rushed Mary to the hospital again. This time, she was pronounced brain dead and passed away on February 22nd, 1979. She was a week short of being 4 months old. Marybeth claimed that she found her baby unconscious in her crib. An autopsy would be done and revealed no reason for her passing, and was ruled SIDS. She was already expecting again, and Jonathan Tinning, their 8th child, was born on November 19th, 1979. In March of 1980, as you can already guess, Marybeth brought in her unconscious baby Jonathan to the hospital. Because of the family history, the doctors wanted to send him to the hospital in Boston. Once he arrived there, he underwent many tests, but they couldn't find any reason as to why he had stopped breathing all of a sudden. So, he was sent home. Days later, Marybeth returned to the local hospital holding her son, who was pronounced brain dead. He died on March 24th, 1980. With the lack of investigation aside, even if she had had no hand in it and it had been an inherited health problem, how could she in good conscience keep having children? Suspicions would finally begin catching up with Marybeth in 1981, when her adopted son Michael died. If it had been an inherited health condition killing her babies, that would have been a tragedy. But was it really all just medical misfortune, an inherited death curse? When their adopted son suddenly died in his sleep on March 2nd, 1981, it couldn't be ignored anymore. It wasn't possible, if it was an inherited disease, for him to have died of the same thing, as he was not biologically related to them. He'd died in his sleep, having been found by his mother, Marybeth. She rushed him to the doctors, where they believed that he had had pneumonia. An autopsy would be done on Michael, and it would reveal that he actually did have pneumonia, but it certainly was not severe enough to have caused his death. However, for some reason, again, nothing was done. Then, Tammy Lynn Tinning, their 9th child, was born August 22nd, 1985. Of course, you already know what's coming. She would die just months later. On December 19th, 1985, Marybeth, along with her daughter Tammy, spent the day with a friend and her neighbor, Cynthia. Later that night, Marybeth, in a panic, called Cynthia instead of calling the ambulance service. When Cynthia arrived at Marybeth's house, she found her standing over Tammy Lynn, who was laying on the changing table, not breathing. Cynthia, who was a nurse, couldn't find any signs of life. EMS soon arrived at the home and brought Tammy Lynn immediately to the hospital, where she was pronounced dead. When Cynthia asked Marybeth what had happened, she told her that she had found Tammy Lynn tangled up in the blankets. The emergency staff, knowing her history of losing children, was immediately suspicious, and they reached out to police. The next morning, Cynthia went to check on Marybeth and was shocked to find her eating breakfast with her husband like nothing was wrong. Then, later at Tammy Lynn's funeral, Cynthia reported that Marybeth was smiling and eating and didn't appear to be upset at all. It's like her baby's death didn't bother her. She even seemed to be enjoying herself. People said that Marybeth had always seemed to be a loving mother and would fawn over her children, and were often seen in the neighborhood bringing her babies on walks. If she was such a devoted mother, why was she not distraught over her child's death? The same day of the funeral, she was brought in for questioning. Of course, the autopsy would find no cause of death, but this time the police weren't going to accept it. Even though over the years many people who knew the Tinnings were increasingly suspicious, it wasn't until the death of her 9th child that the police finally stepped in. In January of 1986, Marybeth was read her Miranda rights and was placed under arrest and then questioned again. During the questioning, she walked detectives through each of her children's deaths, but the detectives weren't buying it, as details weren't adding up. After hours and hours of interrogation, she finally admitted to killing 3 of her children. She would only admit to smothering Timothy, Nathan, and Tammy Lynn. The only reason she gave for doing it was that she just wasn't a good mother. She would later deny that she was read her rights and that the police were intimidating her. But one of the investigators would reveal under oath that she had waived her rights and had agreed to questioning. She was trying to have the case thrown out, but it didn't work. She was found guilty in July of 1987 and was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. She was denied parole 6 times before being released on parole in August of 2018. And as one of the universe's sick jokes, she is still alive today and is currently 81 years old. Although she was never officially diagnosed with Munchausen's by proxy, it is believed that she represents perhaps the worst case of it in history. Now we come to our last and most famous case of Munchausen's by proxy. Claudine Dee Petrie was the youngest of 5 children and grew up in southern Louisiana. She grew up being told that she had a heart murmur, which made her more delicate than other children. She was babied and wasn't allowed to do physical activities with her siblings or other children. Now, it is believed that Dee herself was a victim of her mother's Munchausen's by proxy. When Dee was 24, she met 17-year-old Rod and began dating, which is disturbing in its own right. A 24-year-old has no business dating a teenager, especially one who's still a minor. Regardless, they found out that Dee Dee was pregnant, and they wanted to do the right thing, so they got married. It didn't last long at all, and they separated before Gypsy was born on July 27th, 1991. From the beginning, Dee Dee was concerned with Gypsy's health. She brought her in to be evaluated for sleep apnea when she was only 3 months old, claiming that Gypsy regularly stopped breathing in her sleep. After several tests, the doctors would conclude that there was nothing wrong with Gypsy. She was a perfectly healthy baby with no genetic disorders or otherwise. But that's not what she would tell Gypsy's father, Rod. Dee Dee told Rod that Gypsy had a chromosomal defect and that she would have health issues that would stem from that. And as time went on, the conditions that Dee Dee told people that Gypsy had would only grow in number. Gypsy was told by her mother that she had leukemia, which is a type of blood cancer. She gave Gypsy medications, and to make sure that Gypsy looked the part, she shaved her daughter's head, telling her that her hair was going to fall out anyway from the chemotherapy. Dee Dee had Gypsy tested for muscular dystrophy, and even though that test came back negative, she would make Gypsy use a wheelchair. She was a perfectly healthy child. She could walk. So, one of the neurologists that saw Gypsy suspected that her mother might have Munchausen's by proxy, but he didn't have enough evidence, so he kept it to himself. Dee Dee told doctors that Gypsy was having seizures that were causing brain damage, which led her to being put on medication. Unfortunately, this caused her to have side effects which affected her oral health. On top of that, Dee Dee would numb Gypsy's gums, which would lead to her drooling. Dee Dee would bring this drooling problem up at the doctors, and she had Gypsy's salivary glands surgically removed. Without enough saliva, she had dry mouth, which caused further dental issues, and she would have several teeth removed. Gypsy also supposedly had asthma, and also had a feeding tube. This feeding tube allowed Dee Dee to control how much nutrition her daughter was getting, and allowed her to make sure that her daughter remained underweight, so she appeared more sickly. Gypsy was in essence tortured by her mother in many different ways. The only actual issue that Gypsy suffered with was strabismus and poor vision. Poor vision is easily fixed with glasses. It's a condition that millions of people have. And strabismus is a condition that I am familiar with myself. It is a condition where the muscles of the eyes are weakened and don't hold the eyes in alignment. I personally have worn eye patches, glasses, and have had 2 operations to attempt to align my eyes. It's not a condition that I think about that often, and it certainly doesn't dictate my life in any way. From time to time, you may see that my eyes do not line up. But for a woman who wanted her child to be sick so she could get attention, strabismus would not have been a severe enough condition for her to get the medical attention that she craved. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit Louisiana head-on, destroying over 800,000 homes, one of which belonged to Dee Dee and Gypsy. Dee Dee would use this disaster as an excuse for why she didn't have any medical records, documents, or paperwork. She would claim that Gypsy's birth certificate had been destroyed, and this allowed her to begin lying about how old Gypsy was, claiming that she was much younger than she really was. Even Gypsy wasn't sure how old she was. As Gypsy grew older, she became harder to control. She knew that she could walk and was frustrated by her mother's refusal to let her gain any sort of independence. In 2011, she tried to run away from home with someone she'd met at a sci-fi convention, but she was tracked down and brought home. And, according to Gypsy, her mother then tied her to her bed and destroyed her computer, which was her only connection to the outside world. Eventually, she was able to secretly get access to the internet and joined a Christian dating site. That's how she met Nicholas Godejohn. As they grew closer, she told him all of her secrets and asked him if he would protect her. He agreed and said that he would do anything to protect her, even if it meant protecting her from her own mother. In June of 2015, he drove all the way down from Wisconsin to her home in Missouri. He murdered Dee Dee while Gypsy waited in another room. After a strange Facebook post, Dee Dee Blanchard was found dead at her home, and Gypsy was nowhere to be found. After tracing the IP address of the posts made on Dee Dee's Facebook page, they were able to find Gypsy and her boyfriend hiding out in Big Bend, Wisconsin. They were both arrested, and soon the shocking truth came out. Gypsy wasn't sick and had never been sick. She could walk and was able to walk into the courtroom without any mobility aids. And just as shocking, it was learned that she had convinced her boyfriend to kill her mother in order to set her free. Turns out that her mother and her didn't have the close, loving relationship that they had portrayed to everyone. Gypsy Rose Blanchard is without a doubt the most famous victim of Munchausen's by proxy today, and her fame has only grown since she was released in December of 2023. She has appeared on talk shows and has been living her best life, which comes with its own controversy. And Nicholas Godejohn, who committed the murder, was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. Quickly before I go, I do want to mention one other case of Munchausen's by proxy. Unfortunately, I don't want to make this video any longer, but if you want to check out a story of a person who was falsely suspected to have Munchausen's by proxy and was separated from her daughter, which led her to taking her own life to save her daughter, please check out the documentary Take Care of Maya on Netflix. It really shows that falsely accusing someone of Munchausen's by proxy can be just as damaging to the victim as Munchausen's by proxy itself. Anyway, that's it for today. If you want to learn more about today's topics, see the description box below to find my resources and recommendations. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more morbid topics from me, like this video, subscribe to my channel, and comment below. See the community page to vote on next week's topic. A new video drops every Monday. Remember to be merry, but stay morbid.